The heat rose from the asphalt in visible waves that August afternoon in 1994, shimmering like ghosts along Route 87 in West Texas. Anyone who has driven through that stretch of highway knows the feeling, that peculiar sensation of being watched by an emptiness so vast it seems to breathe. The land stretches flat and endless, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional oil derrick, pumping slow and rhythmic like a dying heartbeat. On August 14th, 62-year-old Thomas Granger and his 8-year-old grandson Dylan were making what should have been a simple trip from Lubbock to La Mesa. Thomas, a Vietnam veteran who had spent 23 years in the Army before retiring to his ranch outside town, was known for his punctuality. His neighbors would later describe him as the kind of man who set his watch by the sun and never missed a deadline. Dylan, his daughter's only child, had been spending the summer with Thomas, helping feed the horses and learning how to fix fence posts under the scorching Texas sky. They left Thomas's ranch at 2:15 in the afternoon. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. The plan was straightforward: drive the 43 miles to La Mesa, pick up parts for Thomas's tractor from the agricultural supply store, maybe stop for ice cream at the Dairy Queen on Main Street, then head back before dinner. Thomas's daughter, Rebecca, was expecting them home by 6. She had a pot roast in the oven. They never arrived. At first, Rebecca wasn't particularly worried. Her father was capable, self-sufficient, the kind of man who could handle himself in any situation. Maybe the truck had broken down. Maybe they had decided to stay a bit longer, grab dinner in town. But when 7 o'clock came and went with no phone call, something cold settled in her chest. Thomas always called. Always. By 8:30, she had contacted the Lubbock County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Frank Holloway took her statement, his tone professional but not yet concerned. In rural Texas in 1994, people ran late all the time. Cell phones were rare, expensive, mostly used by business executives and drug dealers. If someone's truck broke down between towns, they might not find a payphone for miles. But Rebecca knew. A mother knows. A daughter knows. Something was very, very wrong. The first search began at dawn on August 15th. Sheriff's deputies drove Route 87 in both directions, checking the shoulders, scanning for any sign of Thomas's forest green 1989 Ford F-150. They checked the ditches, the access roads, even the private ranch properties along the route. Nothing. The truck had simply vanished, as if the desert itself had opened up and swallowed it whole. What made the disappearance particularly unnerving was the route itself. Route 87 was not some obscure backcountry road. It was a main highway traveled regularly by locals and truckers alike. On an August afternoon, dozens of vehicles would have been on that road. Yet not a single person reported seeing Thomas's truck disabled, in an accident or pulled over. No one saw them at any gas stations. The clerk at the agricultural supply store in La Mesa confirmed they never showed up for the parts order Thomas had called ahead about that morning. It was as if they had reached a certain point on that highway and simply ceased to exist. Then the investigation intensified over the following days. Search and rescue teams combed the surrounding desert. Volunteers from 3 counties showed up with ATVs and horses, forming lines and walking through the brush, calling Dylan's name into the wind, and the Texas Rangers got involved. FBI agents arrived from the El Paso field office, treating it as a potential kidnapping given the child's age. But there were no ransom calls, no demands. No bodies, no blood, no truck, nothing at all. The family released photos to the media. Thomas in his Sunday best, his face weathered and kind, with crow's feet that deepened when he smiled. Dylan with his gap-toothed grin, his hair sun-bleached almost white, holding a fish he had caught at Lake Allen Henry just 3 weeks before. The images played on local news stations across Texas and New Mexico. Tips flooded in, hundreds of them, each one leading nowhere. One witness claimed to have seen the green F-150 pulled over near milepost 73 with its hood up. But when investigators searched that area, they found nothing, no tire tracks, no oil stains, no evidence anyone had stopped there recently. Another caller insisted they had seen an elderly man and a young boy at a truck stop in Roswell, New Mexico, 3 days after the disappearance. The investigators drove to Roswell and showed the photos around. No one at the truck stop recognized them. Theories multiplied like tumbleweeds in a windstorm. Had Thomas, suffering from some undiagnosed medical condition, driven off into the desert in a state of confusion? Had they been the victims of a random crime, pulled over by someone posing as a law enforcement officer? Had they witnessed something they shouldn't have, something that got them killed? And the drug trade angle received serious attention. In 1994, Route 87 was known as a corridor for narcotics trafficking from Mexico. Cartel violence was escalating. Perhaps Thomas and Dylan had accidentally stumbled into something, seen a drug deal or a handoff. Perhaps they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, witnesses who needed to be eliminated. But again, no evidence supported this. No cartel killings in the area around that time. No reports of unusual activity, and if a cartel had wanted to disappear someone, they were efficient about it. They didn't usually take vehicles. They left warnings, messages, examples for others to see. Thomas and Dylan's disappearance bore none of those hallmarks. Rebecca appeared on television, her face drawn and pale, pleading for information. She set up a tip line. She hired a private investigator, a former Texas Ranger named Walter Hayes, who had a reputation for solving cold cases. Hayes spent 6 months working the case, interviewing everyone who had known Thomas, mapping out every possible route they could have taken, and checking every abandoned building and mine shaft within a 100-mile radius. He found nothing that moved the needle. As 1994 turned into 1995, then 1996, the case went cold. Not forgotten, never forgotten by those who loved Thomas and Dylan, but shelved, filed away. The leads had dried up. The searches had yielded nothing. The FBI moved on to other cases. The local sheriff's department kept the file open, but no new information came in. Rebecca held memorial services without bodies to bury. She kept Dylan's room exactly as he had left it, his toy cars arranged on the windowsill, his baseball glove on the dresser. She never remarried. She never stopped looking. Years passed. A decade, then 2. The case became a local legend, one of those unsolved mysteries that old-timers talked about at diners and bars, shaking their heads at the impossibility of it all. How do 2 people simply vanish in broad daylight on a major highway? Where was the truck? Where were the bodies? Some people insisted they had been abducted by aliens. West Texas had no shortage of UFO sightings after all, and the Roswell incident was still fresh in cultural memory. Others believed it was government-related, that Thomas had been involved in something during his military service, something classified that came back to haunt him. The theories grew more elaborate with time, more detached from reality. But the truth, whatever it was, remained hidden. In 2018, Rebecca passed away from cancer. She was 67 years old. To the very end, she kept a photo of Dylan on her nightstand, his little face frozen in time, forever 8 years old. She died without answers, without closure, carrying the weight of that August day for 24 years. The case might have remained cold forever, relegated to true crime forums and unsolved mystery documentaries, and just another tragic footnote in the vast catalogue of people who disappeared without a trace. But in March of 2024, something changed. A rancher named Luis Mendoza was repairing a fence line on his property 12 miles south of Route 87, deep in the kind of terrain most people never see, that accessible only by dirt roads that wash out every time it rains. His property had been in his family for 3 generations, over 8,000 acres of hard Texas land that barely supported cattle ranching anymore. Luis was 63, weathered by sun and work, the kind of man who knew every rock and crevice of his land. He was digging a new post hole when his shovel hit something solid. Metal, rusted and buried, but definitely metal. At first he thought it was an old piece of farm equipment, maybe something his grandfather had abandoned decades ago. But as he cleared away more dirt, his stomach dropped. It was a license plate. Texas issue. And even through the rust and corrosion, He could make out partial numbers and letters. Louis stopped digging. He walked back to his truck and called the sheriff. By late afternoon, a team of investigators was on site. The license plate was carefully excavated and documented. Back at the lab, forensic analysts worked to restore the faded characters. It took 3 days of meticulous work with specialized chemicals and imaging technology. When the results came back, the room went silent. The plate matched Thomas Granger's 1989 Ford F-150. The excavation became a full-scale operation. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in, scanning the area around where the plate had been found. The readings showed a large metallic object buried approximately 6 feet underground, roughly the size and shape of a pickup truck. A forensic archaeological team was assembled. The FBI reopened the case. Media descended on the site like vultures, helicopters circling overhead, satellite trucks lining the dirt road leading to Louis's property. The excavation took 2 weeks. It was slow, painstaking work. Every layer of soil was carefully removed, sifted, documented. Photographers captured every stage. The earth around the site was bone dry, packed hard by 30 years of Texas sun. As the shape emerged, there was no doubt. It was a truck. Forest green paint still visible in patches where the rust hadn't completely consumed it. The bed, the cab, the distinctive body shape of a late 80s Ford F-150. Thomas Granger's truck. But it was the position of the vehicle that made seasoned investigators pause. The truck wasn't simply abandoned and buried. It was vertical, nose down, as if it had been driven into a pit and covered over. The engineering required to achieve this would have been substantial. Heavy equipment. Time. Planning. This was not a random crime. This was calculated. When they finally reached the cab, they found skeletal remains. 2 sets. One adult-sized, seated in the driver's position. One child-sized in the passenger seat. Both were still wearing seatbelts. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. Thomas Granger. Dylan Granger. After 30 years they had been found. But finding them only deepened the mystery. The forensic analysis revealed disturbing details. That there were no signs of trauma on the bones, no bullets, no fractures consistent with assault. The truck's windows were intact, still rolled up. The doors were closed. If someone had buried this truck with them inside, why were there no signs of struggle, no attempts to escape? Toxicology was impossible after 3 decades, but the investigators could make certain deductions from the scene. The truck's position, the sealed environment, the lack of defensive wounds, all pointed to one horrifying possibility. They had been buried alive. But even that didn't fully make sense. The engine was still in gear. The keys were in the ignition. If someone was going to bury people alive, why leave them in a running vehicle? Why go through the elaborate process of digging a pit large enough to accommodate a truck oriented vertically? The soil analysis added another layer of strangeness. But the earth directly around and beneath the truck showed signs of having been excavated and refilled, but the layer above showed minimal disturbance to the natural stratification. Whoever buried this truck had done so with enough skill to hide it from aerial searches and ground searches for 3 decades. They had disguised the surface, making it blend seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. This required knowledge, expertise, and resources. This wasn't some opportunistic criminal, but this was planned, executed with precision. The FBI formed a task force. They re-interviewed everyone who had been questioned in 1994, those who were still alive. They pulled Thomas's military records, looking for connections, enemies, anything that might explain why someone would want him dead. They examined every detail of his life, his finances, his relationships, his service record. Thomas had been a logistics officer in Vietnam, later stationed at Fort Hood, but his record was exemplary. No disciplinary issues, no classified assignments that might have made him a target. After retirement, he lived quietly on his ranch, growing hay, raising a few head of cattle. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't politically connected. He was just a grandfather taking his grandson to buy tractor parts. Dylan was 8 years old. A child, innocent. There was no conceivable reason anyone would target him specifically. Yet someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make them disappear. The property where they were found belonged to Luis Mendoza's family, but in 1994, the family had leased portions of the land to various parties for hunting and oil exploration. The investigators pulled leasing records from 30 years ago, compiling a list of everyone who had legal access to that section of property in August 1994. 11 names came up. 6 were deceased. 3 had left Texas decades ago. 2 remained in the area. One of those names was particularly interesting to investigators: Clayton Voss. In 1994, Voss was 36 years old, a heavy equipment operator who worked for a construction company based in Midland. He had leased hunting rights on the Mendoza property for 3 years, from 1993 to 1996. He knew the land. He had access to backhoes, bulldozers, the kind of machinery needed to dig a pit and bury a truck. When investigators went looking for Clayton Voss in 2024, they discovered he still lived in the area, now 76 years old, retired, living in a mobile home on the outskirts of Midland. On April 3, 2024, 2 FBI agents knocked on his door. Voss was cooperative, almost eager to talk. He invited them in, offered coffee. He remembered having the hunting lease in the 90s. He remembered 1994 well because that was the year his mother died. He showed them photos, documents, receipts from that time. He seemed genuinely shocked when they told him about the discovery of the truck. But as the interview progressed, something felt off. Voss's memory was sharp about certain things, specific dates, specific events, but vague about others. When asked directly if he had ever seen Thomas Granger or his truck on the property, Voss paused for a long moment before answering. He said no. He said he never saw them. But his eyes said something different. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Voss's property. They found nothing that directly connected him to the disappearance. No journals, no trophies, no evidence. But they did find something in his garage that raised eyebrows. A framed photograph from 1994, showing Voss standing next to a bulldozer on what appeared to be desert land. In the background, barely visible, was a fence line that matched the configuration of the Mendoza property. The date stamp on the back of the photo was August 17, 1994, 3 days after Thomas and Dylan vanished. Voss was brought in for formal questioning. He denied any involvement. He explained the photo away, claiming he was working a job on adjacent property. He passed a polygraph test, though investigators knew those weren't foolproof. They couldn't place him on Route 87 on August 14th. They couldn't prove he had ever interacted with Thomas Granger. They had no witnesses, no physical evidence tying him to the crime. But they had suspicions. Strong ones. The case consumed the nation. Cable news shows devoted hours to the story. True crime podcasts dissected every angle. Internet sleuths created elaborate theories. The buried truck became a symbol of something darker, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it plans. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides its work so well that decades pass before the truth begins to surface. And in May of 2024, just when investigators thought they had reached another dead end, something else happened. Something that would crack the case wide open, in a way no one anticipated. A package arrived at the FBI field office in Lubbock. No return address, postmarked from Amarillo, but inside was a VHS tape. The tape was labeled in block handwriting Granger, "Watch alone." Watch alone. The VHS tape sat in an evidence locker for 3 days while the FBI debated how to proceed. In 2024, finding a working VCR wasn't as simple as it once was. The format had been dead for over 2 decades, relegated to thrift stores and nostalgia enthusiasts. But the Bureau's forensic lab maintained equipment for exactly this kind of situation, old technology preserved for cases that reached back into analog eras. Special Agent Monica Reeves, was assigned to view the tape first. She was 41, a veteran of the Bureau's violent crime unit, and she had seen things that would break most people. But as she sat alone in the viewing room on May 8, 2024, watching the tape flicker to life on the old monitor, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Pure, cold dread. The footage was grainy, shot on a handheld camcorder, the kind that was common in the mid-90s. The timestamp in the corner read August 14, 1994, 3:47 p.m. The location appeared to be desert terrain, flat and featureless, the sky bleached white by the afternoon sun. The camera was positioned on what looked like a tripod, aimed at a large rectangular pit that had been excavated in the earth. The pit was approximately 15 feet deep, 12 feet wide. At the bottom sat Thomas Granger's green Ford F-150, nose down, angled at roughly 60 degrees. But the truck wasn't empty. Through the windshield, barely visible in the harsh shadows, were two figures in the cab, one large, one small. Both appeared to be moving alive, their hands pressed against the glass. Agent Reeves felt her breath catch in her throat. The camera angle shifted slightly, as if whoever was filming had adjusted it, and then a figure walked into frame. The person wore coveralls and work boots, but their face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a bandana wrapped around the lower half of their face. Their build suggested male, average height, solidly built. The clothing was generic, forgettable, the kind of outfit 1,000 ranch workers in Texas might wear on any given day. The figure stood at the edge of the pit for a long moment, looking down at the truck. Then they raised one hand in what could only be described as a wave. Casual, almost friendly. And then they walked out of frame. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The camera continued recording, capturing the truck in the pit, the two figures inside visible through the windshield, their movements becoming more frantic. Then came the sound. Low at first, growing louder, the unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery. A bulldozer entered the frame from the left side. The same figure was operating it, still wearing the hat and bandana, their face completely hidden. The blade was already loaded with earth. What happened next lasted 11 minutes and 43 seconds. Agent Reeves watched every second, unable to look away, unable to stop the tape, even though every instinct screamed at her to shut it off. The bulldozer made multiple passes, pushing load after load of dirt into the pit. With each pass, the pile grew higher. The truck began to disappear beneath the earth. First the hood, then the roof of the cab. The windshield remained visible for a while, and through it, the two figures could be seen, their hands beating against the glass, their mouths open, in what must have been screams that the camera's microphone couldn't capture over the sound of the engine. And then they were gone, covered over, buried beneath tons of Texas soil. The bulldozer continued its work, smoothing the surface, spreading the dirt evenly across the area. The operator took their time, methodical and unhurried. When they finished, they climbed down from the machine, walked back to where the camera was positioned, and reached forward. For just a moment, before their hand covered the lens, their eyes were visible above the bandana. Light-colored, blue or gray, completely calm. The tape went black. Agent Reeves sat in silence for 5 full minutes before she could bring herself to leave the room. When she did, her hands were shaking. She had witnessed murder before, seen crime scene photos and autopsy reports that would haunt her forever. But this was different. This was calculated cruelty on a level that defied comprehension. Someone had not only killed Thomas and Dylan Granger, they had filmed it. They had kept the tape for 30 years. And now, for reasons unknown, they had sent it to the FBI. The question was simple and terrible. That's why. But season Trumpo. The task force reconvened within hours. The tape was analyzed frame by the Bureau's best forensic video specialists. They enhanced the image, isolated details, measured shadows and angles. The timestamp was confirmed to be authentic, not added later. The tape itself was a standard JVC model sold widely in the early 90s, impossible to trace. The desert location was compared against satellite imagery and geological surveys. Based on the topography visible in the background, the distinctive rock formations barely visible on the horizon, the analysts were able to narrow down the filming location to within a 2-mile radius. It matched the area where the truck had been excavated. The bulldozer in the footage was a Caterpillar D6, a common model used in construction and agriculture. Records showed that Clayton Voss's employer in 1994 owned 3 D6 models. But so did dozens of other companies in the region. The serial numbers weren't visible in the footage, and the figure operating the bulldozer remained unidentifiable. Their face was never shown. Their body language revealed nothing distinctive. The clothing bore no logos, no identifying marks. Even the gait analysis, a technique that could sometimes identify individuals by the way they walked, yielded no useful results. The person moved with deliberate care, as if aware they were being recorded and determined to leave no trace of their identity. But the FBI had one advantage the killer might not have anticipated: DNA. In the analog era, people weren't as conscious of trace evidence. They didn't know about skin cells, about the microscopic material humans shed constantly, about how modern forensics could extract DNA from surfaces touched decades ago. The VHS tape itself, the cassette housing, the cardboard mailer it had arrived in, all were sent to the lab for processing. It took 6 weeks. The DNA profile that emerged was partial, degraded, but usable. It was run through every database available: Cody's military records, genealogical databases that had exploded in popularity over the past decade as people sought to understand their ancestry. On June 22, 2024, they got a hit. Not a direct match, but a familial connection. The DNA on the tape shared markers with a woman named Judith Keller, age 79, living in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She had submitted her DNA to a genealogy website 3 years earlier, hoping to find relatives. Investigators approached Judith carefully. She was elderly, living alone, and had no criminal record. When they explained the situation, showed her the family tree connections the genetic genealogists had mapped out, her face went pale. She had a brother, Eugene Keller, 5 years older than her. They hadn't spoken in over 20 years. Eugene had been a construction foreman in West Texas during the 90s. He had worked for multiple companies, moving from job to job, never staying anywhere too long. Judith described him as troubled, angry, someone who had come back from the Gulf War, changed in ways the family couldn't understand. He had been in Army Corps of Engineers, deployed during Desert Storm in 1991, tasked with building infrastructure and clearing obstacles. He knew demolition. He knew excavation. He knew how to operate heavy machinery. In 1997, Eugene had simply disappeared from the family's life. He stopped returning calls, stopped showing up for holidays. Judith assumed he had moved away, started over somewhere. She had tried to find him a few times over the years, but he seemed to have vanished as thoroughly as his victims. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt. Eugene Keller's name and photo were released to the public. He would be 84 years old now, if he was still alive. His military photo from 1990 showed a square-jawed man with those same pale eyes that had stared into the camera for that brief moment on the tape. Tips flooded in from across the country. Sightings in Montana, Florida, Oregon. None panned out. Eugene Keller had no credit cards, no bank accounts, no digital footprint whatsoever. If he was alive, he was living completely off the grid. But investigators had another lead. In going through Eugene's work history, they found something interesting. In August of 1994, he had been employed by the same construction company as Clayton Voss. They had worked together on multiple projects. They knew each other. On 2, Voss was brought in for questioning again. But this time, confronted with the connection to Eugene Keller, his demeanor changed, and the friendly cooperation evaporated. He demanded a lawyer. He stopped talking. Search warrants were executed on every property Voss owned or had access to. In a storage unit he rented under his deceased mother's name, Investigators found boxes of documents dating back to the 90s, receipts, time cards, and buried in one box, a photograph that made everyone in the evidence room go silent. It showed Eugene Keller and Clayton Voss standing together next to a bulldozer, the same bulldozer from the tape. The date written on the back was August 10th, 1994, 4 days before Thomas and Dylan disappeared. And in the background of the photo, barely visible, was a green pickup truck. The make and model were unclear, but the color was unmistakable. The pieces were falling into place, but the most crucial question remained unanswered. Why? What possible motive could Eugene Keller have had to murder a retired Army veteran and his grandson? The answer came from an unexpected source. A historian at the Army's Criminal Investigation Command had been reviewing Thomas Granger's service record at the FBI's request, looking for any connection to Eugene Keller. On the surface, there was none. They had served in different eras, different units, different wars. But then the historian found something in the archived records that made her pause. In 1991, Thomas Granger had been temporarily recalled to active duty as a consultant. The Army was investigating allegations of theft and black market activities among certain Corps of Engineers units in Kuwait. Equipment was going missing. Fuel was being diverted. Someone with logistics experience was needed to audit the supply chains and identify the leaks. Thomas had spent 3 months in Kuwait, reviewing records, interviewing personnel, compiling his findings. His final report was classified, but the historian had the clearance to read it. In that report, Thomas had identified 3 individuals he believed were involved in the theft ring, recommending courts-martial. One of those names was Eugene Keller. The case against Keller had been dropped due to insufficient evidence. He was transferred stateside, given a general discharge, allowed to fade into civilian life. But Thomas Granger's report remained in his file, a permanent black mark on his record. It had cost Keller his military career, his benefits, his future. But Eugene Keller was not the forgiving type. The FBI now had motive, means, and opportunity. They had DNA evidence. They had testimony from Voss, who, facing charges as an accessory to murder, finally started talking. Voss admitted that Eugene had approached him in August of 1994, offering money in exchange for access to the Mendoza property and the use of construction equipment. Voss claimed he didn't know what Eugene was planning, that he thought it was something to do with hiding stolen goods or setting up an illegal operation. But after the Grangers disappeared and the massive search began, Voss had put the pieces together. He knew what Eugene had done, and he had said nothing, terrified of becoming implicated, of losing everything. He had lived with that knowledge for 30 years, the guilt eating at him, but his fear of Eugene Keller had kept him silent. Until now. And, with Voss's cooperation, investigators learned that Eugene had been obsessed with Thomas Granger for 3 years, following him, learning his routines, and waiting for the perfect opportunity. When he learned that Thomas would be driving to La Mesa with his grandson, isolated on a long stretch of highway, Eugene saw his chance. The working theory was that Eugene had staged some kind of roadside emergency, perhaps posing as a stranded motorist. Thomas, being the helpful veteran he was, would have stopped. Somehow, Eugene had disabled the truck or forced them off the road. Exactly how remained unclear, but he had gotten them to the burial site, possibly at gunpoint, forced them into the pit in their own vehicle, and buried them alive. The cruelty of it was staggering. Eugene could have simply shot them and buried the bodies, but he wanted them to suffer. He wanted Thomas to know, in those final terrible minutes, that this was revenge, and that his honesty, his integrity, his adherence to duty had cost him everything. The nationwide manhunt for Eugene Keller intensified. His face was on every news channel, every social media platform. The reward for information leading to his capture reached $500,000. And then on July 4th, 2024, a body was found in a remote cabin in the mountains of northern New Mexico. The cabin belonged to a man who had been living under the name David Thompson, a recluse who bought supplies in town once a month and otherwise kept to himself. He had been dead for approximately 3 weeks, the victim of what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Local sheriff's deputies had only found him because a neighbor had noticed vultures circling and called it in. When FBI agents arrived and processed the scene, they found identification in multiple names, military memorabilia from the Gulf War, and a journal, hundreds of pages written in cramped handwriting, detailing decades of rage and resentment. Eugene Keller had been dead since mid-June, having taken his own life just days before the FBI released his name to the public. It was unclear whether he had somehow learned his identity was about to be exposed or whether it was simply coincidence. The timing would remain one of the case's many mysteries. But the journal provided answers to questions no one had dared to ask. Eugene had killed before. Thomas and Dylan Granger were not his first victims. The journal contained descriptions of at least 4 other murders between 1992 and 2003, all people he believed had wronged him in some way. A former employer who fired him, a girlfriend who left him, and a neighbor who called the police on him, and a lawyer who couldn't get charges dismissed. The FBI opened investigations into each case, trying to match Eugene's descriptions to unsolved disappearances and murders across the Southwest. Some matched. Others remained ambiguous. Eugene's writing was often vague, coded, as if he enjoyed the game of keeping secrets even from himself. But about Thomas and Dylan, he had been explicit. Pages upon pages describing the surveillance, the planning, the execution. He described forcing them at gunpoint to drive their truck into the pit he had prepared. He described Thomas begging for his grandson's life, offering himself in exchange for Dylan's freedom. He described ignoring those pleas, sealing them in the truck, turning on the bulldozer. And he described returning to the site periodically over the years, standing above where they were buried, feeling a satisfaction that nothing else in his miserable life could provide. The journal's final entry was dated June 18, 2024. In it, Eugene wrote that he had sent the tape to the FBI because he wanted credit for his work. He was old, dying of cancer he refused to treat, and he couldn't stand the idea of his greatest accomplishment remaining hidden forever. He wanted the world to know how clever he had been, how perfectly he had executed the crime, how thoroughly he had evaded justice for 3 decades. In his mind, he had won. Even in death, he believed he was the victor. The revelation that Eugene had mailed the tape himself, essentially confessing to prove his own genius, fit a profile the FBI's behavioral analysts had been developing. He was a narcissist, a sadist, someone who derived pleasure not just from the act of murder, but from the power of keeping secrets. But in the end, his ego had outweighed his self-preservation instinct. He wanted recognition more than he wanted safety. Thomas and Dylan Granger were finally laid to rest in September of 2024, 30 years after they vanished. Hundreds of people attended the funeral. Rebecca's children, Thomas's grandchildren who had never known their uncle or their great-grandfather, stood at the graveside with tears streaming down their faces. And the community of Lubbock, which had never forgotten the missing veteran and his grandson, turned out in force. Clayton Voss was charged as an accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. He pled guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, receiving 15 years in federal prison. At his sentencing, he addressed the family, his voice shaking, saying he had been a coward, that he should have come forward decades ago, that no amount of punishment could equal the guilt he had lived with. The other victims Eugene had described in his journal were investigated. 3 were confirmed, matched to cold cases in Arizona and New Mexico. The families who had spent decades without answers finally had closure, though the truth they received was far more horrible than the uncertainty they had endured. The case closed officially in November of 2024. The FBI held a press conference, laying out the timeline, the evidence, the conclusion. They praised Luis Mendoza for his diligence in reporting the license plate. They thanked the genetic genealogists whose work had identified Eugene Keller. They acknowledged that, without the killer's own arrogance, without his need to claim credit for his crimes, this case might never have been solved. But the victory felt hollow. Justice had not been served, not really. Eugene Keller had escaped accountability, dying on his own terms, never facing trial, never forced to confront the families he had destroyed. The tape he sent had been his final act of cruelty, forcing everyone who watched it to witness the last moments of Thomas and Dylan's lives, to carry that horror forever. In the aftermath, true crime enthusiasts and legal experts debated whether the tape should be released to the public. Some argued for transparency, believing the full truth should be accessible. Others insisted it would only serve Eugene's purpose, giving him the notoriety he craved. The FBI ultimately decided to keep the footage sealed, citing respect for the victims and their families. But the case raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, about how someone could carry out such calculated cruelty and then live a seemingly normal life for decades afterward. Eugene Keller had not been a monster hiding in shadows. He had been a neighbor, a co-worker, someone who bought groceries and paid taxes and blended seamlessly into society. And that was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all. As 2024 drew to a close, the case of Thomas and Dylan Granger remained a touchstone in discussions about unsolved crimes, about advances in forensic science, about the role of genealogy in solving cold cases. But for those who loved them, for the family that had waited 30 years for answers, it was simply the end of a nightmare that had consumed their lives. Rebecca never knew the truth. She died believing her father and son were still out there somewhere, lost but not gone. Perhaps that was a mercy. Perhaps not knowing was better than knowing the horror they had endured. On the stretch of Route 87, where Thomas and Dylan were last seen alive, a memorial marker was placed in December of 2024. It reads simply, "In memory of Thomas Granger, U.S. Army veteran, and Dylan Granger, beloved grandson. Lost August 14, 1994, found March 2024, gone but never forgotten. Drivers passing by often stop, leaving flowers and flags and notes. The desert wind carries them away eventually, scattering them across the endless Texas landscape, but new ones always appear, and a testament to the fact that even in death, even after decades, some people refuse to be forgotten, and the land keeps its secrets until it doesn't. The truth waits in the earth, patient and terrible, until the right person digs in the right place. And sometimes, when the truth finally emerges, it changes nothing and everything all at once. Thomas and Dylan are home now, resting in the red Texas soil they loved. Eugene Keller is gone, his ashes scattered to the wind by a state that had no interest in providing him with burial rights. And somewhere in FBI archives and hard drives and sealed evidence rooms, the tape remains, a record of humanity's capacity for calculated evil, a reminder that the worst monsters are often the ones we never see coming. The case is closed. But for those who know the full story, who have seen what Eugene Keller recorded on that August afternoon in 1994, the horror lingers. It sits in the back of the mind, surfacing at unexpected moments. A reminder that beneath the ordinary surface of everyday life, darkness waits. And sometimes, it waits for 30 years before revealing itself.